Between 1885 and 1908, the population of the Congo Free State fell by an estimated 10 million people, not from war, not from famine alone, from a rubber quota system so brutal that soldiers were ordered to bring back a severed hand for every bullet they fired, to prove they hadn't wasted ammunition on anything but punishment. Most people think the Congo's tragedy was a colony gone wrong. It wasn't a colony. It wasn't even a country. It was one man's private company, and that company's entire business model ran on terror. This isn't a story about empire in the way we usually tell it. It's a story about a single human being who acquired personal, legal ownership of a landmass 76 times the size of Belgium, and then ran it like a plantation with a flag. That man was Leopold II, King of the Belgians. And here's the detail that makes this whole story so uncomfortable. Belgium, the actual country, didn't own the Congo. Leopold did, personally, not as a king acting for his nation, but as a private individual holding a private title, the way you or I might own a house. The Congo Free State was, on paper, his. So let's go back to how one man managed to get his hands on an entire continent's worth of territory. By the 1870s, Leopold had spent years watching other European powers carve up colonial fortunes in Asia and Africa, and he was furious that tiny Belgium, a country he considered beneath his ambitions, had nothing to show for it. Belgium's parliament had no appetite for colonial adventures, no money to spend on distant territories, and no interest in the schemes of their king. Fine, Leopold decided. He would simply do it himself, with his own money, under his own name, and figure out how to fold the profits back to himself later. This is worth pausing on because it's genuinely unusual. Most colonial ventures of the era were backed by national treasuries and national armies. Leopold's was backed by loans, private investors, and his own personal fortune, precisely so that no parliament could tell him what to do with it. In 1876, he organized something called the International African Association, a body that sounded like a scientific and humanitarian society, dedicated to exploration and the abolition of the Arab slave trade in Central Africa. It was, in reality, a shell. Leopold used it to fund expeditions, most notably those of the explorer Henry Morton Stanley, whose journeys down the Congo River gave Leopold the maps and the leverage he needed to make his move. Between 1880 and 1884, Stanley, working directly for Leopold and not for Belgium, signed treaties with over 400 local Congolese chiefs. Most of these men could not read the documents placed in front of them. They were often given cloth, trinkets, or liquor in exchange for marks that Stanley's translators later represented as full transfers of sovereignty over their land. The chiefs believed, in many documented cases, that they were signing trade agreements or friendship pacts. What they were actually signing away, according to the documents Stanley carried, was the entire territorial and mineral rights of their homeland, in perpetuity, to a European monarch none of them had ever met. Armed with hundreds of these signed treaties, Leopold took his case to the great powers of Europe, and in November of 1884, representatives of 14 nations gathered in Berlin for a conference that would decide the fate of an entire continent, with not a single African representative in the room. The Berlin Conference is usually remembered as the moment Europe formally divided Africa among its empires. But buried inside that conference was something stranger and more specific: the recognition of Leopold's personal claim to the Congo Basin. Leopold's pitch to the assembled powers was masterful in its cynicism. He presented himself not as a monarch seeking territory, but as a philanthropist. He promised free trade for all nations, the suppression of the slave trade, and the uplift of the Congolese people through Christian civilization. Britain and France, suspicious of each other's ambitions in the region, found it easier to hand the territory to a supposedly neutral humanitarian than to let a rival power claim it. Germany's Bismarck, hosting the conference largely to manage tensions between the other powers rather than to seize territory himself, saw Leopold's proposal as a convenient way to keep the Congo Basin out of both British and French hands without provoking either. On February 5, 1885, the conference recognized Leopold's personal sovereignty over the Congo Free State. Not Belgium's, his. He now owned, in his own name, roughly 900,000 square miles of Central Africa. For context, that's larger than England, France, Germany, and Spain combined. And he owned it the way a man owns a business, not the way a nation governs a territory. There was no parliament in the Congo, no courts independent of his authority, no press. The entire administrative and legal structure of the territory answered to him alone, an ocean away in Brussels, in a palace most of his new subjects would never see and could not have located on a map. For the first few years, Leopold's Congo wasn't especially profitable, and he poured enormous personal debt into propping it up, borrowing against his own future to keep the enterprise afloat. He needed a product that could turn this territory into cash. And in the early 1890s he found it, not through any innovation of his own, but through a global accident of timing. In 1888, a Scottish veterinarian named John Boyd Dunlop had patented the pneumatic rubber tire. Within a few years, the bicycle craze swept Europe and America, and right behind it came the automobile. Suddenly, the world needed rubber, and it needed it in quantities no one had ever demanded before. The Congo Basin happened to be covered in wild rubber vines, and Leopold, sitting on personal legal title to nearly 1 million square miles of it, realized he was holding the deed to what was about to become one of the most valuable commodities on Earth. So in 1891 and 1892, Leopold issued a series of decrees that reshaped the entire territory around a single purpose: rubber extraction at maximum volume, minimum cost. He declared all vacant land in the Congo the property of the state, meaning his personal property. Since almost no Congolese communities held European-style land deeds, this meant, in effect, that Leopold had just declared nearly the entire territory his own private estate overnight, including the land indigenous communities had lived on and farmed for generations. Their labor became, by decree, an obligation owed to the state, owed to him. Here is where the mechanism turns from bureaucratic land theft into something far darker. Leopold did not have the manpower to personally enforce rubber quotas across nearly 1 million square miles. So he built a private paramilitary force called the Force Publique, staffed by a small number of European officers, commanding a much larger body of Congolese and other African conscripts, many of them themselves coerced into service. And he gave regional agents brutal financial incentives to hit rubber targets. Agents received bonuses tied directly to how much rubber their district produced, and steep penalties, including the loss of their own jobs and income if they fell short. This single design choice, Tying personal European income to Congolese labor output is the entire engine of the horror that followed. It meant that every officer in the territory had a direct financial reason to extract more, faster, by whatever means worked. Villages were assigned rubber quotas they had no realistic way of meeting. Men were pulled from their fields and sent into the forest for weeks at a time to tap wild vines that were often already stripped bare from previous harvests, forcing them to travel further and further from their homes each season just to find enough sap to meet the same demand. Failure to meet quota brought immediate and calculated punishment. Village hostages, often women and children, taken and held until quotas were filled, homes burned, and floggings with a whip called the shikot, a strip of dried hippopotamus hide that could kill a man after enough lashes. And then there were the hands. Force Publique soldiers were issued a fixed number of bullets and were required to account for every single one. To prove they weren't wasting ammunition hunting animals, or worse, saving bullets for a mutiny against their own officers, soldiers were ordered to bring back a severed hand for every round fired. This created a horrifying incentive structure of its own. When soldiers missed a target or used bullets on something other than punishing villagers, they still needed hands to present. So hands were taken from the living to cover for bullets used on the dead, and eventually from the living simply to meet the count. American missionary William Shepherd, working in the Kasai region, documented and photographed these mutilations directly, later testifying that he personally counted baskets containing dozens of severed hands delivered to a single post as proof of a single raid. British missionary Alice Seeley Harris did the same, and her photographs of survivors, men, women, and children, with amputated hands and wrists ending in scar tissue, became some of the first images in history to be used deliberately as evidence in an international human rights campaign, projected on lantern slides at public meetings across Britain and the United States. The population collapse that followed is one of the most disputed and most staggering statistics in modern history. Estimates vary, and historians debate the exact methodology, but the most widely cited figures, drawn from demographic reconstruction by scholars including Jan van Sina and Adam Hochschild, put the population decline at somewhere between 5 and 10 million people during the roughly 2 decades of Leopold's personal rule. Some died from direct violence. Many more died from starvation, as men were pulled away from farming into rubber collection for weeks at a stretch, leaving fields untended and food stores empty. Others died from disease, sleeping sickness, and smallpox, spreading unchecked through communities stripped of their labor force and social structure, with no functioning medical infrastructure to slow it down. And a portion of the decline came from a collapsing birth rate, as families were torn apart, men were conscripted or killed, and communities destabilized beyond the point of recovery. For years, almost none of this reached the European public in an undistorted form. Leopold ran one of the most sophisticated propaganda operations of the era, funding sympathetic journalists, hosting glowing tours for hand-picked visitors who saw only model stations and cooperative chiefs, and successfully branding the Congo Free State internationally as a humanitarian project, bringing civilization and commerce to a backward continent. He had, after all, sold the entire enterprise to the Berlin Conference on exactly that premise, and for over a decade, most of Europe simply took him at his word. The story cracked open because of 2 men working from very different positions, a shipping clerk and a diplomat. Edmond Denis Morel was a British employee of a shipping line that carried cargo between Belgium and the Congo. Reviewing the manifests as part of his job, Morel noticed something that didn't add up. Ships were arriving in Antwerp, packed with valuable rubber and ivory, but the ships heading back to the Congo carried almost nothing of comparable value in return, mostly guns, chains, and administrative supplies. There was no meaningful trade happening. Morel realized he was looking at the paper trail of forced extraction, not commerce. He quit his job and spent the next years of his life building one of the first great international human rights campaigns in history, publishing evidence, organizing meetings, and building an alliance that would eventually include Mark Twain, Arthur Conan Doyle, and Booker T. Washington, all of whom lent their public reputations to a cause most Europeans had never heard of. The second man was Roger Casement, a British consul stationed in the Congo. In 1903, the British government commissioned Casement to investigate conditions in the territory. What he produced, the Casement Report of 1904, was a meticulously documented account of the mutilations, the killings, and the quota system, built from first-hand testimony and physical evidence Casement gathered himself, traveling deep into the interior to interview survivors directly rather than relying on official Congo state briefings. The report landed like a bomb in European public opinion. It was precise, official, and impossible to dismiss as exaggeration or propaganda from a rival colonial power, precisely because it came from Britain's own government, rather than from campaigners alone. Under mounting international pressure and facing a Belgian parliament that was growing increasingly uncomfortable with what its king's private company was doing in its name, Leopold was forced to relinquish personal control. In 1908, the Congo Free State was formally annexed by the Belgian government and became the Belgian Congo, a state colony rather than a king's personal property. Leopold, by this point in poor health, died the following year in 1909. Before losing control of the territory, he ordered the destruction of the Congo State archives, reportedly telling an aide that he would give them his Congo, but they had no right to know what he had done there. It's an act widely interpreted as a deliberate attempt to erase the paper trail of what had actually happened under his rule. The switch to Belgian state control in 1908 improved conditions in the Congo, but it did not undo the underlying colonial relationship, and abuses, forced labor, and exploitation continued in less extreme forms for another half-century, until the Congo finally gained independence in 1960. Even then, independence did not bring stability. The territory's first democratically elected leader, Patrice Lumumba, was overthrown and assassinated within months, with Belgian and American intelligence involvement now well documented, and the decades of dictatorship, civil war, and resource-driven conflict that followed in the Democratic Republic of Congo can be traced, in part, back to the institutional void and extraction-based economy Leopold's private state had built in the first place. What makes the Congo Free State such an unsettling case study isn't just the scale of the death toll, staggering as it is. It's the mechanism. This wasn't a rogue colonial administration losing control of its own soldiers. It was a deliberately engineered financial incentive structure. Tie European income directly to raw material output from a population with no legal protection, no representation, and no recourse. And the violence isn't a bug in that system. It's the predictable output of it. And that's the pattern worth sitting with, because it didn't end with Leopold, and it didn't end with colonialism in the form we usually picture. Modern supply chains for cobalt, a mineral the Congo happens to hold roughly 70% of the world's reserves of, and which now powers the batteries in our phones and electric vehicles, have drawn documented comparisons to exactly this same structure: distant demand, extractive quotas, and a local population bearing the physical cost of a resource boom it barely shares in. None of this is to say every modern supply chain is Leopold's Congo. It isn't, and collapsing that distinction does a disservice to the specific, deliberate horror of what happened between 1885 and 1908. But the underlying question the Congo Free State forces us to ask is a durable one. What happens when the people who profit from an extraction system are separated by distance, by law, or simply by convenient ignorance from the people who pay its human cost? Leopold answered that question in the most brutal way imaginable and built an entire private state around the answer. The rest of us are still living with versions of the same question today. If this gave you a new perspective on a piece of history most people never learn in school, consider subscribing to the channel. We dig into the systems and financial mechanisms behind history's darkest chapters, not just the individuals, because understanding how these systems actually work is the first step toward recognizing them again. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.